Eliza has left me for the moment, and excuse me, I am William Little. I have stopped over here to visit with the Myers and Eliza, and of course I knew Lawrence from way back. But I wanted to stop in here today, and they said, well, reminisce to us while you're here. Reminisce to us a little about your background, where you came from, who you are, how you happened to be here and in Sudbury. Well, it's like this. I, of course, am related to Delaware. I came to Delaware, actually, way back in the beginnings of the town. In fact, originally I came from the state of Connecticut. Moved out here, ended up in the village of Worthington. And after being in Worthington for some time and deciding what am I going to do, what type of an occupation am I going to have, well, then I decided I think I'm going to be a saddler. I thought that would be an occupation, and when I learned that the new town of Delaware would be beginning, I decided that perhaps that would be the spot. But I learned early on they already had a saddler, so that was not going to be a possibility. At the time while I was still in Worthington, a man by the name of Moses Bigsby, I'm sure you're all familiar with Moses Bigsby in this area. In fact, I understand that there were some shenanigans going on that didn't actually work out so well. But Moses Bigsby, he had plans. One of his plans, of course, was to do a mercantile business, to have a dry goods store. He had everything he needed, but then he changed his mind and had other thoughts instead. He ended up leaving Worthington and coming over to Berkshire. By the way, this trip over here from Delaware today, I think of that trip and coming through Berkshire. In fact, I think of this road coming across. It wasn't a bad trip at all, coming over to this spot. Of course, the hardest spot, the place that I did not like to cross was the Alum. Oh my, the Alum. The Alum is not so bad, the creek itself. The creek is okay. It's the steep sides. And I have learned that even stagecoaches, in making the trip, have tipped over, coming down or up those sides of that steep creek. But no, the trip from Delaware to Sudbury, the road is much better, actually, than the pike from Delaware to Worthington. That is nothing but mud, that trip from Delaware to Worthington. Back, though, to Mr. Bigsby. He moves to Berkshire. In fact, he even tries to convince me to move to Berkshire, and I'm still in Worthington. Not too long after taking Lamb, the doctor, the surveyor, Mr. Root, then moving on to Berkshire with them, he gets the place started as though with dreams of having Berkshire the state capital. Changes his mind, leaves those people that he had convinced to come to there, and comes across to Delaware, where he starts the new community. Lays out the streets with Azariah Root. They lay out the streets, start this new community back in 1808. And let me tell you, at that point, we truly were on the edge of the frontier. This was wilderness. When I moved there, and I moved there in the first year. I was one of the very earliest settlers. I ended up buying out the supplies of Mr. Bigsby while still in Worthington and deciding, I think I'll go into the mercantile business, start myself a dry goods store in that new frontier community, and I bought all his supplies and then moved into Delaware, that new village, that new spot on the frontier. And I can tell you that was an experience. Now, Mr. Bigsby had laid out the streets. I still hear people say, and I think the same thing, they wonder sometimes why he laid those streets out so wide. To many of us, it was just more mud to walk across from one side to the other, and the streets of the main part were wide. But in getting started there, by now Mr. Bixby was there, Dr. Lamb was there, Surveyor Azariah Root was there, I am there. In fact, I can say that proudly that I voted in the very first election in that frontier town. There in the following fall, I was the 16th voter, as the poll books would show, in that frontier community. Now, my place of business where I began was right there on the main corner of the new village. I was on the northwest corner of the street named William and Sandusky. Across the street was already a mercantile business, and wouldn't you know, it had connections with Mr. Bixby, though he was not running it. And then mine was on the opposite side. That was a challenge. And in 1808, things were struggling in this small community of Delaware, as I'm sure the struggles of all small towns like Sudbury. But then starting it there, some of those challenges of being in this frontier surrounded by forest, and questions of the Indians, and questions of the wildlife, the animals, the wolves. There was lots of teeming wildlife around us. At any rate, I began that store, and business began well, though. I will say, though, that in those first few years, there were not many people in that community. In fact, even some 9 years later, a woodsman walked to a hill just to the west of the village, looked back out over the town one frosty morning, and took the first census of the community. Well, it was sort of a census. He counted the number of lines of smoke rising above in the trees in the distance, and he surmised that because there were some 32 streams of smoke, that there were 32 cabins in the community. And then you multiply that by the number of people in the family, or as perhaps just an individual, that you had perhaps 100 to 150 people living in the community at that time. Now, that was some 8 or 9 years later. During those first few years, though, the struggles and the concerns and with people there in that community and trying to exist on this edge of humanity, this town was struggling. And to give business, though brisk at times, was a struggle. And it was a struggle for one man to be able to take care of this business there in that town. The goods were typical mercantile business goods, anything from crockery to shoes to hardware to all types of different cloth, the things that people needed to survive. They were there, and people would come in mainly to barter. Money was not usually something exchanged in those early times. It was mainly just bartering back and forth. I have this item, we need this item, would you be willing to trade? Or on credit. I will pay you at the next crop when it comes in, I promise, if I may have this item now. And that was a way you would do business. That was my business, right there on that main corner. Now, you'd think in a wilderness, with all the problems of getting started, that there wouldn't be time for other things. Yet I think of back to those first days. Here we are now, some 30-some years later. And back then, when we were starting, already people were thinking, where are we going to have a ball field? And they put it right down near the center. Just in the southwest corner, or southeast corner of that same intersection, just past where the tavern was, a ball field was started up. They would play quoits or wildcat, different types of activities, They also had bees, quilting bees, and sugar fests, and all types of activities. A lot of courting going on in some of that as well. That was the way it was, even in the very beginning. Now, and by the way, excuse me for wearing my hat. It's a new hat, and I thought I would share that here with the people of Sunbury when I came. Regarding the town, though, getting started, it was a struggle as a businessman. I was staying first at the store, and then I purchased land across the street, halfway down the block of Sandusky, and built my house. There's where I live with my wife. We raised family. At that stop, the house, as I remember, it sat right out against the street. It's still standing there. The yard was back behind for a whole block, with all the fruit trees and wildlife behind the house. That was my home. Now, I was badly in need of help there at the tavern. And sure enough, a young man comes to town. I say a young man, actually still a boy, comes to town. His name's Benjamin Powers. Comes up from Worthington. I'd known him there. I'd known the family. I'd known Avery Powers, his father, who, by the way, lost his life fighting the Indians up along the lake during that second war with Britain. And so his wife, widowed now, was raising her child, Benjamin, and Benjamin needed occupation. He worked for a while in the town of Franklinton in Columbus. But on the other hand, Benjamin also was looking for something better. And he decided to come to that frontier town of Delaware. He comes here in 1815, and he is 15 years of age. And he seeks employment from me. And I thought, well, good. I will give you a chance. I'll pay you to work for me. I know you have no means of money. In fact, I'll let you live in the store. You may live in the room at the back of the store. And then you could also then be our clerk, along with myself. You see, originally, when I built this home, or this building, or whatever we want to call it, when I built this business here on this street, as I say, I needed someone to assist, because it's not easy running that mercantile on my own. And when Benjamin came to town, I thought, well, this would be a perfect opportunity. Now, I ended up paying him $1 a week to clerk in my store. And that would also include a place to live. He was quite happy with that. Did I make the right decision? It could not have been a better decision than choosing Benjamin Powers as my partner. Because you see, at the very beginning, I was in business with Mr. Reuben Lamb, Dr. Lamb. Dr. Lamb actually owned the land, and we went into business, into mercantile business, but I realized from the very beginning that he was really there more for property end of it. He had other interests. He, after all, was the doctor of the town, the only doctor. He also had a distillery back along the creek that runs through the village. Built a distillery there, and in this distillery, he ran that with a man by the name of Rutherford Hayes, who had come here from Vermont, and the two of them opened up this distillery, and so his interests were there. We continued to call the mercantile business my dry goods store Lamb and Little, but it was really Little who was running it myself. So I was so happy when Benjamin came and became a part of it. Eventually, bought out Mr. Lamb, and it became the Little store, and then with Benjamin coming in, it became Little and Powers, Benjamin Powers, as part of the business. One of the reasons it was so good to have had him was this. You know, in the mercantile business, when you're dealing with these items, There are many of these throughout the territories, throughout every village would need at least one of these, and sometimes there was more than one. I decided that regarding the items themselves, of course I could send away for them and have them shipped there. The problem was I found that oftentimes, even though you had placed the order, not the best items came. Sometimes I was not happy with the quality of some of the things that came to my store for me to sell, or a mix-up had taken place. I did not have all the items that I wanted, and that's important for these people living here in this wilderness to have the items available. Now that I had Mr. Powers, I could now spend 2 months every year traveling to Philadelphia. And there I would not just order my items, I would hand pick every single item that I had for the store to sell. All of those items were hand picked by me so that I had the best. And we had the best cloth, we had the silks, the velvets, the satins, and the common cloth as well. We also had the best of the shoes, the best of the mercantile business of the hardware and so forth. The number of people who therefore would come to my store was amazing. We really did do well once we got that established. And I knew that I could leave very safely and go to Philadelphia for 2 months because I had Benjamin. Benjamin, there could have been no one more reliable than he. And everything worked out perfectly well. I do go back to that earliest time, though, because there were struggles even before Benjamin arrived. This town itself was struggling. The Delaware was just barely existing, just barely hanging on, and the war came. Again, that second war with Britain. And the war was taking place mainly to the north, up near the lake, up farther on across the lake. And that is where the British were located with their allies, the Indians. And there is what drew the armies of the United States. The main army of William Henry Harrison, the Army of Harrison, came to our town up the military highway, the Sandusky Pike, the Sandusky Military Road, the War Road as they sometimes called it. Came here to this town, more than once passing through, and then it was February of 1813, during the war, that they got to this town with a major group of the army, Harrison leading. And let me tell you, the road farther north was impossible. You were now going to have to head through the swamps to get to the lake. And that road was impossible. The freezing and the thawing made the army have to stop, and they stopped in Delaware. Harrison's army comes to town then during that winter, and they are stuck. They cannot move any farther through February, through March. His headquarters for his entire army is Delaware. He has all of these supplies of horses and with his army, and he cannot house them over the winter. So instead, he sells them to we, the townspeople, who buy them, take care of them, and then in the spring, sells them back to the army at a larger price. I tell you, though, that army really put a boost into this struggling community, a community that's less than 5 years old. And here he has an entire army. Governor Shelby of Kentucky is right behind Harrison's army, and they too stay at the edge of this community. All of these soldiers, all of these people coming to my town and to my business, and it certainly gave a boost to us, them being here. Before moving north to fight the British and the Indians. Which brings me to this question about the Indians. You know, in this territory, to this day, I still see the Indians coming through this area. And for the very first day, virtually, I saw them. Now, let me tell you about this. They would come to my store as any other customer. Now, in the early days, they came occasionally, and then with the war, things sort of died away. They did not come so much. When the war ended, they began coming back. The Indian problem, you know, or the questions of what was going on among our people, it kept everyone on edge, particularly during those war years. The fear of whether or not there would be an attack as far south around this area. There were Indians still living out and trading, even though officially they were not living in this area, but they were still there in the woods and the forests. They were still occasionally finding places or traveling through to hunt. That brought them to our town. Now, during those times, though, things slowed down as far as their business, but as soon as the War of 1812 ended, the business picked up. Was there ever an attack during those years? Of course not. Not in this area. Never a problem in this area. The most I can ever think of is the time when the big scare took place. When the troops up at the fort at Fort Morrow to the north of us, a day or so north of us, when those troops supposedly had been attacked at night, and the scare came out that the fort was destroyed and that there was going to be that the Indians were going to be attacking here, and the people of Radnor escaped attack, and they came toward Delaware. I can picture that scene that morning, being at that store and seeing Radnor rumbling through our town, saying, "Run for your lives, that the Indians have attacked. They're just behind us." And they continued south. Now, we did have a fort. I guess you could call it a fort. It really wasn't a fort. It was the business across the street from me. That business across the street from me was surrounded at one point during those troubled years with a palisade that they put for protection, with the building still inside. I can tell you, though, that if I got a good running start down William Street and I headed towards that fort at full speed, I don't think I would have had a problem diving over those walls. It was not much protection. And everyone knew that. So some of the people of Delaware, they fled with Radnor when they came through. I and others, though, thought this could not be happening, but just in case, let's go across the street, let's go into the fort, and let's wait into the palisade, and we'll wait there. Nothing happened. Never a problem. Never any danger here. I can tell you this, though. I could remember during those years, around the time of the war, was when the man by the name of Tecumseh was spreading fear among the settlers by going to different tribes and convincing them to join them. I remember the day that the Greentown Indians from farther to the northeast, way up past into the next county over, and they came through this town surrounded by the army. The Greentown Indians, as they were called, and they were forced to leave their land. Their land was taken from them. The army insisted that they leave, even though they had been friends to the village right close by. I mean, the settlers' village. The settlers did not want them to leave. But the army insisted. They said, "We are moving you to a reservation to the west, over near Piqua, and that's where you will stay." They were concerned that Tecumseh would come and have influence over that peaceful tribe. They were not happy, though, before they left the village, they had been convinced by the minister of the town, of the village, of the settlers, who was a good friend of their leader, said, "You must leave, or there will be a war with the army right here." And so he was convinced to leave with the promise that they could come back later and they could get what items they could not carry with them the first time. And yet, as soon as they left, it was not before they were even out of the sight from the trees in the distance they could look back. They were already burning down their village. They would never have a chance to come back. And they were embittered. I bring all that up because I can picture that group came through this town surrounded by the army on their way to pick one. A sad, sad scene as they were being forced to move to another location. But enough of that. I can tell you, though, that with the war ending and with the peaceful times coming, my business thrived with the Indians. I mean, they came from as far, particularly from the north, 50 miles or more, to shop at my store. They were there from the north, and they would bring with them for trade at my village, my store, my mercantile business. They would come into that store, and they would sometimes just amazed to see what new there was there. And they would walk around, and they would look at things, but they also brought things for trade, particularly furs. That was big for them. Furs and cranberries during the cranberry season. The cranberries in the north, in their area, were fantastic and in great quantity. I can picture coming through our town and stopping at my store, 50 ponies in one group, laden with baskets of cranberries on either side of the pony, with all of these Indians. The Wyandotte were the group that was bringing these. And they would stop at the store and they would barter and trade cranberries to me for different items that they would need. And the trade was their business right then. Also, they would bring, as I say, furs. And also, they brought sugar. Oh, the sugar camps to the north was quite a thing for the Indians. And the Wyandotte would bring down quantities of sugar. I can tell you this, though, they came to my store and they would carry their sugar in the skins of the animals that they had, of the furs. And they would take these furs with this quantity of sugar and dump it out on my counter. And then we would gather it and place it in a container for sale. Customers who were in the store, when the Indians would bring this to the store, they did not like that. Oh, they loved the sugar. They were in these dirty skins, and they thought, oh, we don't want to buy that because of that. The word got back to the Indians. I didn't think much of it, but one day, as the Wyandottes were coming in, they were carrying the sugar in buckets. Very nice, large buckets. And they would then sell or barter the sugar to me for sale. I didn't think about where they got the buckets, but then at a time, a man named Mr. Sweets, who lived north of the village, came to me one day and said that for some reason the conversation came up that the Indians would stop at his place and want a bucket. Oh, they wanted a bucket from him. Not to buy. They wanted me to give them this bucket, which I agreed to. They promised that they would bring the bucket back. And sure enough, after I gave them the bucket, they took out their skins with all the sugar inside, dumped it into the bucket, and then continued on to Delaware and they would stop at my store carrying his buckets with all the sugar. They would also trade the furs, but the furs were empty of the sugar. And the word got out that no longer was this quantity of sugar being carried in skins. Sure enough, on the return trip past Mr. Sweetzer's, they would take the buckets back, as they had promised, and give them back to Mr. Sweetser. And then they would have them available the next time they came with a quantity of sugar. Those were the times with those Indians, and I never had a problem with any of them. They were very good to deal with. And they were always interested in what I had. You know, they started that town, in fact, in Delaware, before I got there. As I understand the story, that there were no trees standing in the area where my store was, or all around that area, but there had been Indians there before. When a village was nearby, they cut down those trees to grow corn. It was certainly advantageous for us when we came in. There was less work for the first settlers. I think perhaps that was why Mr. Bixby chose that spot to begin the town, partially because of the fact that there were no trees there close to the river. That was the setting with those Indians, though, in that town. Now, I've also been told this by a man that I knew who lived south of Delaware. His name was Mr. Seller, and he spoke of coming to this town. Told me that he came to this town in 1802. There was no town there in 1802. He said he came here looking for lost hogs. Now, Mr. Seller lived halfway between Delaware and Worthington, and on that trip, on the area where he lived, he had some hogs, and he also was a gunsmith, and his main customer were the Indians. And he had a very good relationship with them. One time his hogs got out, and he inquired if any of them had traveled here to see him, had seen them, and he said, yes, they're far. I've seen some farther north, up along the river, up along the Whetstone. And he got his two sons, and they traveled north to see if they could find the hogs. And they looked around the area, and they went to the west just a little ways from the river, and they found one person living along the creek in what Mr. Teller described as a hovel, a very small hut lived in by one man. He said his name was John Blackbird, but he was an Indian. And they asked him if he had seen hogs, and said, yes, up on the hill back behind. Mr. Seller said to this man, the problem is, it's getting late in the day, and I'm wondering, is there any way that we could stay with you tonight and then get the hogs tomorrow? He said, sure, you may stay with me. And his son, his one son, stayed with his father there in that hut. And they described that there was a deer hanging down from the ceiling, and that they were cutting their meal. He offered them a meal that night from the deer that was hanging in the center of his hut. There were skins hanging on the walls. John Blackbird. I've often wondered whatever happened to John Blackbird. I never remember seeing him. The time that this happened was 6 years before there was a town of Delaware. Mr. Seller said, I actually visited this spot where the town is now, 6 years before there was a town. And Mr. Blackbird, John Blackbird, was the only man living here. The only other Indian, the last Indian that I think of that I remember seeing around this area, was a man with the name of, well, I don't know his name, but he was an Indian living just near the north of the town. He was a rather quiet man. He came in occasionally and stopped in my store. Very pleasant man. The townspeople liked him. Supposedly he lived just a short distance north of Delaware along the Horseshoe Creek, and there very close to the Whetstone River. And he had a cabin there along that creek. and he would hunt and fish by himself. But one evening, going back to his hut, the story is told to me, he said, 2 people from this community got drunk one evening. 2 young men decided that they would go out and kill the last Indian of this area. It never be proved that they were the ones, but most everyone in the community seemed to think they were definitely the ones who killed, that these 2 men, these 2 young guys, went out and killed him. It was a shame that that happened. Well, anyway, I mentioned about this, that they were drunk. Now, let me tell you, though, about drinking in our community. From the very beginning of our community, drink was a major thing. I mean the alcohol, I mean the beer, the spirits, a major part of the frontier community. Well, after all, as I mentioned earlier, Lamb and Hayes, they had the distillery too, down by the creek. And let me tell you too that my own store, I see a glass here. Sure. A glass very, very similar to a glass like I had in my mercantile business. And I set that glass on the counter, the front counter of the dry goods store. After all, virtually every business would be remiss if they did not have a quantity of spirits available for their customers. They would place the common glass there for everyone to drink from, and when they came in, I, of course, or Benjamin would speak to the customer and say, "May I interest you in a glass of our finest drink?" And they, of course, would oblige and drink from that glass. It was quite common among the stores. After all, it was good business. It was business for the person who owned the store. And good business, too, because once they have had a little bit to drink, they're more likely maybe to buy some more things in your store than they normally would by giving them enough alcohol to drink. So the drinking in my store was an important thing. Let me tell you, though, it wasn't just the store. I can remember that I myself am an Episcopalian, a member of the Episcopal Church, in fact, a founding member of the Episcopal Church in our community. There's also the Methodist Church, a major force in our community, and also the Presbyterian Church. Now, I can tell you, though, that regarding alcohol, it would not be an overstatement. It would be something that would almost be expected, that when the Hayes family and the Lamb family, Hayes and Lamb, their distillery, when our new church was started, the distillery offered a large quantity of alcohol for building our church. It was a community gesture. It was only right that they would offer them, and the Episcopalians gladly accepted their offer of a large quantity of alcohol, of beer from their distillery. Let me also tell you that, as did the Presbyterians, as did the Methodists, when their churches were being built, of course they were offered large quantities. In fact, it didn't go farther than that. In fact, the pastor, the leader of their church, was also offered a large quantity as part of the actual salary of that pastor, and gladly accepted. Oh yes, it is a major part of our community. There are those who certainly abuse it. I can tell you this, our teenagers, if they find someone who has been totally to the point of passing out from drink, and they have gone way beyond the limit. If they find one person like this along the street somewhere, they will go and get a barrel. They will spread his arms over the top of the barrel and his legs under the barrel and commence to roll the barrel. Roll the barrel back and forth, over him, until finally everything in his stomach has been discharged to the point that he now has been awoken to this terrible feeling of drunkenness. But they have gotten rid of everything in his stomach. Not a pleasant thing, and certainly not something, I would imagine that it has even driven some people not to drink, just the fear of having these teenagers do this to them. And so life here on this early frontier and in my business, I can tell you the good times, though, and some very good people that I have known. Oh, I think of course, Lamb, and I think of my neighbor. My neighbor was Mr. Manser, and he had a cabinet shop on the main block here, just across the street, in his house. And then my house was right next door. The Mansers came here, I believe they came from Connecticut also, and they moved to this land. And then just north of the town, I mentioned Mr. Sweetser. And Mr. Sweetser and his wife Gertrude, they came here back during those first few years of the community. Now I can tell you that they had 5 boys and 3 girls, including a baby who was 6 months old when they left, on a 40-day trip to get here, with all kinds of problems. 2 wagons. Mr. Sweetser, he was in charge of one wagon, and Mrs. Sweetser, Gertrude, was in charge of the other wagon. And she drove this wagon the entire way, also nursing her 6-month-old child. It would have been quite an experience for them. I also think of other families in the community and the Averys who live just west of our community and their long trip to get here. I understand that Mr. Avery, on his farm just west of Delaware, has been involved with, there are rumors that he has been involved with hiding runaways who are escaping from the South, another subject of our times. I can tell you this, I can think of 2 incidents in particular on our town. One happened just 2 years ago in 1842. 1842, coming to this community through this town, Charles Dickens himself, all the way from England, in his travels here, traveling far to the west and coming here. On that route, I mentioned that mud route from Columbus to Delaware through Worthington, and once you left Worthington, it was mud. And Charles Dickens followed that route in the carriage that they brought him in the stage. And in stopping here, my friend Benjamin, I was away, of course, at the time, but Benjamin was there, and another man in the community said he saw Charles Dickens get out of that carriage and come into our store and buy candy. I thought, I'm sorry I missed that incident. I'm sorry I did not see him. But I did see, earlier though, in the year 1817, the President of the United States came to this town. Who would have ever believed that a president would ever come to this town? Out here in this wilderness. That was James Monroe on his trip to the west. Coming down from Sandusky, stopping here in this town overnight, staying across the street. We eventually moved our dry goods store, by the way, from the corner of William and Sandusky to the next corner of Winter and Sandusky. It was there that we saw these incidents that I've just mentioned. Charles Dickens, and then President Monroe, who stayed at the hotel across the street at Dunbar's Hotel, and there he stayed the night, and then attended a church service a block up the next day. And he was here with his entourage. Who would have ever believed, as most in that community, if anyone had ever seen a president before? Well, I am getting now, of course, to my ends of my years. I have moved from my house, of course, there on Sandusky. I have moved to the end of Winter Street. There's where I reside. Benjamin Powers is now entirely in charge of my business. He has taken over that store. And he someday will also perhaps move to another occupation. But it has been quite a thing, living in this town, being in this place. It is wonderful coming over here to Sunbury, too, to visit you and to visit with Eliza. You know, I've had a close association with this community. Let me tell you that it's been a wonderful life. It has been wonderful being able to visit with you today and give you some of my experiences. But it's about time that William Biddle begin to make my trip back through Berkshire, on across the Alum, and back to Delaware. Thank you for inviting me here to be able to visit with you. Goodbye.